So, Kevin, the top grossing charts, there's been very little movement over the last year or two, I guess, with the exception of Pokemon Go very recently. What are kind of the key ingredients of a top grossing game and the common themes and maybe your perspective on Pokemon Go, how they broke all the rules?
Yeah, sure. So, I think before Pokemon Go, I think what we were struck by, 2 to 3 years ago was just how much the top of the charts was starting to be static. And so the top grossing games were sort of games that are not just the ones that not launched recently, but were launched many years ago. So I think this kind of first started with Clash of Clans, Supercell's gigantic hit that just kind of stayed frozen at a #1 spot for years, really. And then that was followed up by a few other more mid-core type of games, and of course Candy Crush, the one casual game up there, just having a really great long shelf life, even though they launched 4 years ago. And so I think the thing that struck me and Kabam is that when we started thinking about how this impacted kind of mobile game developers as we think about building a portfolio, is that we thought, okay, what's going on here? Is there a new trend going on in mobile that we're just starting to see for the first time? And so the first thing that we did was we tried to understand the ongoing downloads and installs of these games. And so, okay, is it the fact that Clash of Clans is still just out downloading everyone else? Is that the reason that they were at the top of the charts, or what else was going on? And I think the most surprising thing that we learned was, despite the Liam Neeson commercials, or despite the Kate Upton commercials for Game of War and so forth that we all have kind of seen, the number of installs for the top grossing games followed kind of what you would expect. When these games first launched, there's a lot of installs. And then these installs, still come in at a pretty reasonable clip, but at a dramatically less, install volume than when a game first launches. And so, we kind of thought, okay, well, let's try to, figure out what these retention curves might look like. And so, that was the beginning of the work, probably about 3 years ago for us, that we said, okay, the thing that is absolutely happening against conventional wisdom is mobile games are retaining their players at a much greater rate than I think most of the market and a lot of people at Kabam would have thought when the mobile games market first started. So I think that revelation of retention being the most important driver, in spite of all these television commercials and Facebook ads that you might see for these games, it was really much more about retention of players than it was about continuing to drive huge amounts of installs, years and years into a game launch. And just to touch on Pokemon Go, because you went there, fascinating. Obviously, I'm sure we're all, I saw a bunch of Pokemon stuff out there and Pokemon hunters, and Pokemon 2 weeks after the launch, they downloaded 4.5 million. There were 4.5 million installs, yesterday. Just absolutely unbelievable how many installs that game is getting, and certainly if you could get 4.5 million installs 2 weeks after launch, you're doing pretty good. But to give you an idea, so Marvel, in the whole first month of the launch of the game, we got about 10 million installs. And so what we're seeing right now with Pokemon is just an unprecedented level of downloads that we probably haven't seen since Candy Crush launched. And it's just a fascinating phenomenon happening right now.
Just a very viral phenomenon and kind of hard to explain. So, Content of Champion, you broke the top 10, and you said focus on retention is key. Can you kind of provide more color? What was the strategy? And it obviously did work. What worked, and what was the focus?
Sure. So, this revelation that long-term retention was absolutely critical made us really start rethinking the way that the whole industry talks about retention. And so I think, when I go to conferences like this and I chat with people about how their games are doing, and I ask, how's the retention of the game going? People, talk about D1s and D7s and D30s, right? And by long-term, some people will throw out some D90, kind of stats. But in a world where you're sort of looking at these top grossing, charts lasting for years and years, it almost doesn't even, I mean, you could sort of say, does your D365 look good? But that doesn't really make that much sense. And so we started rethinking and we said, okay, how do we, for Contest of Champions and all of our games going forward, how do we start thinking about what it is that we're trying to do? And, I'm a big believer that, as much as you want to put the creative and fun into a game and talk about long-term retention, unless you have a way to say, are we doing better? Or, unless you have a way to measure it, you don't have a way to say, are we doing better or worse, with this game? And so one of the big, focus points for us was developing sort of a little bit of a new language around how we think about long-term retention. And I think the first big point here is that we call this group of players regulars, and we measure the stats around these regulars. And so the way that we kind of got to this concept of regulars is looking at games that have been running for many, many years. And so we launched Kingdoms of Camelot 6 years ago. We have another game that in our portfolio called Castle Age that's been around for 7 years. And that game still has about 20,000 DAU, playing that game. It's still a really nice business for us. And so we looked at these games that were sort of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years into its launch and started saying, okay, who are the players that are still playing this game? What are they doing now in the game? And once we kind of understood that, if we go all the way back to the first day that they started playing this game, what were the behaviors? What were the things that these players were doing in the game, right? Because the whole idea was, if you want a game that's running 5 years after the launch, figure out what those players are doing and see if you can create more of that magic, day one of the game. And so one of the things, there's a couple of dimensions that we discovered about these regulars, right? So the first dimension was kind of a time played, standpoint. We looked at across many games in our portfolio. The first aspect of a regular is that they're playing about 15 hours a week. That was kind of the first thing that kind of blew our minds was, mobile was supposed to be this casual experience. Now, Kabam, we're known for making a little bit more sort of core, mid-core, type of games. So maybe we skew higher, maybe we don't. But one of the things that surprised even us was that we had about 15 hours a week, on average across this player base. But even more shocking was looking at the top, decile, which is really a relatively small but an incredibly important, part of our player base. The top decile was playing over 40 hours a week, and this is across multiple games that we saw this kind of a stat. And so you sort of think, from a design standpoint, from an operations standpoint, how do you create enough content? How do you create enough engagement for somebody who's playing a game 7 years and is averaging almost 40 hours a week, week after week after week? It just sort of blew our minds in terms of how we were designing for games, the type of live operations that we were doing, the type of content pipeline and roadmap that we were putting in front of our games. Absolutely blew our minds. And the reason why I talk so much about this is because when you go backwards and you look at the retention of this player base, we see basically 100% retention. Right? I think that's kind of the holy grail that we've been looking for at Kabam, is how do you have a game that you're not going to have 100% retention across the entire player base? That's ridiculous. But if you think about the players that are left playing a game, sort of years after the game launch, if you're to sort of categorize them into a category, again, what we call regulars, how do you get to a point where you can sort of launch a game and be ready to sort of serve this audience and keep this audience engaged for years and years, and sort of be ready for that at the get-go? That's kind of the question that we started with, and how we ended up with this idea that long-term retention for a very specific player base, we got to make sure that we get that right, and then make the game simple enough for people to pick up and play in the first session. But it starts with making sure that there's going to be this incredible player base that can really sink their teeth into a game and play it for much, much longer than we would have ever thought.
So how do the regulars correlate to VIPs, the most heavy spenders?
Huge correlation. So one of the things that we see is that, or one of the big things that made us scratch our heads is that we had some of these VIPs, they come in and they spend, hundreds, thousands of dollars in the first few weeks that they're playing a game, and then they churn out. And we thought, okay, should we figure out how to chase these players and sort of say, hey, come back to the game, we added some more cool stuff for you to play. And then we sort of, the moment of clarity came to us when we said, all right, well, there's going to be, when we looked at the engagement of those players, came in, they played more sporadically, and they spent, a lot of money. And then there was these other players that came in and they played from a time spent perspective much longer in our game, spent less in the beginning, but because they played these games for years and years, they ended up spending more money than some of these VIPs that would come in, drop a ton of money, play for a couple of months, and then leave. And we said, all right, if we're going to focus our designs and live operations and other activities as a company, we can't serve everyone all the time. And as much as it seems odd to say we're not going to focus on some of these VIPs as much, that became kind of the prevailing sort of design philosophy was, okay, those players that come in, they buy a bunch of stuff and then they leave. We're not sure how we can serve them better besides trying to create some more cool stuff, and hopefully they'll come back. But we rather focus our design decisions around getting players to play for a lot, and really these players that play many, many hours a week, how do we design a great experience for them and serve them for many, many years, as opposed to run around chasing a bunch of these VIPs who might have left the game after a few weeks.
So from a practical point of view, for any gaming companies out there, what's the best way to think about UA spend, retention, and associated LTV?
Yeah, so let me start on an LTV question, because I know there's LTV is this very amorphous thing, right? And it turns out that if you look over if you look at a very successful game that's had a multi-year run, I think it's becoming clear to the whole industry that the games that are really, really, that drive a business forward and become something that a company can really invest behind for a long time are games that last many years. And, no surprise, the first, the first few months of game, if you're spending some marketing dollars and so forth, it's a nice hit, it's profitable, but really the sort of sustainability of these franchises come from, running into year 2, 3, 4, and longer. And if you look at LTV, if you try to measure LTV across cohorts over a multi-year, sort of time frame, the retention far and away is the most important thing to focus on, right? And I think that just intuitively makes sense, except how do you talk about retention over multi-years? And is it even safe to estimate an LTV over a multi-year period and then spend marketing dollars against that? So that's a huge question, and I think it's why we think so much these days about when we launch a game, we rather take much more time, get the game to a really steady state by the time we launch it, such that we're ready to really lay kind of the train tracks of content and live operations in front of this game for many, many years. And then, with CPIs these days in the marketplace, you have to be able to sort of commit and say, I'm gonna have this game run for a long time, which means I'm gonna be a little bit more aggressive on my LTVs, and that means I can clear the market for CPIs. But it's definitely a competitive world these days. And I think if you're sort of looking at a 6-month LTV, it's hard to ever get to a point where you can spend any marketing dollars, against a 6-month LTV. You kind of have to go these days to at least a multi-year LTV. What kind of LTVs are you seeing on a game like Content of Champions? So we definitely think that right now so we of course see LTV differ greatly by market, but let's just talk about the US market. I think the US market, you have to get to well into the double-digit LTVs at this point to be able to compete on the CPI front. So CPI is this really interesting thing that kind of scales depending on how aggressive you want to go after it. So we think about the world of marketing spend and players as kind of 3 buckets. One is the acceptor bucket, people that know they want to play this type of genre of game. There's the next ring out is the non-rejectors, people who are like, okay, I don't know if I really like it or not, but I'm willing to give it a try. And then the third ring around that is the rejectors, basically people who are like, that game isn't for me. So you can imagine more of a niche game. I'll just take one of ours, Kingdoms of Camelot. it's kind of a niche game. There's a small core of people who are like, yeah, I really want to play that type of a game. There's a bigger circle of people who are like, maybe I'll give it a try. And then there's a larger circle around them of a demographic that's like, I'm not interested in that game. So CPI fluctuates greatly depending on which part of those circles you want to target. And when we think about CPI, we really want to think about the first two rings of the acceptors as well as the non-rejectors, and make sure that a good CPI, we can scale to a game, for those two sort of circles of audience. And if you're going after those two circles of audience, even in a big, more mass market, sort of a genre, you're talking about $4 to $5 CPIs these days. So it's why you need your LTVs to be in a double digit to kind of get to a point where you can really make that math work.
So branded IP or Hollywood IP or in context of Champions, Marvel's IP probably helped significantly in the CPI, right? How do you see kind of those IP deals, those Hollywood IP deals? How did they develop kind of the economics over the last year? And how do you see that going out the next year or two?
Yeah, so IP deals are definitely one of the ways you could cut through the clutter. And we generally think about IP as something that affects more of the CPI, side of the equation and the marketing efforts, as opposed to driving LTV, although there's some small beneficial effects on LTV. We generally think about, IP deals as, our strategy, and this is not every company's strategy, is that we generally try to come up with the game concept first and say, okay, there's a game that just, has to be built, find a studio team that's really passionate about that. And then you sort of think about the game and the vision of that game, and then you say, okay, does it make sense to partner with an IP partner around that? And I think that's at least for us, a better strategy, because it's really hard to get a studio team that's not passionate about the game or the IP to build something to cater towards that audience because they think it's a good business, as opposed to the other way around of getting a team that's really excited about a game vision and then to go from there. Generally we think that the CPI benefit can be huge. Take Pokemon versus Ingress as a good example. I think we're all starting to see, that one in particular was just a perfect marriage of the IP on top of, really novel new sort of, initial, resolution mechanic around the capturing of the Pokemons and so forth. And then, that all together has led to this crazy success. So I think you really want to make sure that IP is really paired well with the game design. And I think, for example, if you just said, take the game of Pokemon Go right now and you put another great IP Game of Thrones on it, it just wouldn't be as successful, right? You really want this perfect marriage of the IP and the game design. And it probably makes sense to, if you were to think about the team, and I can't speak for that team because I don't know them, but were they more excited about Pokemon or were they more excited about this game that they were building? I kind of think that it was they were excited about the game, and Pokemon just made so much sense on that. And that marriage then came together to drive that huge success.
Any thoughts on the shift on the economics? Is it shifting towards the IP holders or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think the economics are, 4 years ago when we first started, was very favorable for developers. And then, sort of 2 years ago became, as everyone started looking at IP, the IP rights were starting to get bid up. But I think now, when you look at the market now, there's been so many examples of huge IPs put together on top of a game that really didn't do anything. And then the rights holder was like, okay, well, maybe I got 40 or 50% of the economics, but I got 40 or 50% of a very, very small pie. That there's the IP holders are starting to recognize that, it's really about pairing up with a game developer that can make a game really successful, have that long-term retention, have the right economy design, have the right operations, on a go-forward basis, and then get a reasonable piece of a much, much larger pie. And I think that's kind of the prevailing thing that's shifting the economics. I think things are getting to a place that's pretty sane, is incentivizing both for the developer as well as for the IP holder right now.
Great. You recently announced the next game, Avatar. What should we expect?
Well, the Avatar game, we're super excited about it. it's one of those games that we're taking a huge bet in terms of game design. So it takes, all I'll say about that is that it marries kind of casual and very core mechanics together in a pretty interesting way. And so it's a 2018 title for us. So we're still in the kind of early parts of production, but I'm really excited about the talent of the team we have and the ambition of the design.
Okay. Any thoughts on Kabam's growth strategy moving forward? How large is Kabam now, and what are the key drivers?
Yeah, so we've definitely been going through a transition as a company as we focus on a much smaller pipeline of games, and we generally think about creating sort of AAA level of graphics and gameplay. One of the big things that we're doing right now is our technology enables us. The next generation of our games will ship under 100 megabyte client download, which is what kills us on a game like Marvel Contest of Champions, a 700 meg download. You're going to see us really push the edge in terms of gameplay and graphics, but shrink the footprint of our games into a much smaller footprint. So that's kind of a generally speaking, a big thing that we're focused on from a tech perspective that drives real business kind of results. But I think you're going to see us put a lot smaller pipeline of games out. We're targeting roughly 2 games a year, so a much smaller portfolio than we've ever done. You'll see us put games in beta for a much longer period of time to make sure that we really understand that engagement cycle and what the regulars are doing in the game for a lot longer than a more traditional sort of mobile game beta. And then if we feel like we have conviction behind a game, you'll see us launch these games in a much bigger way, because we can't just hope for Pokemon Go to sort of happen. We gotta, I think we're as game developers, we want to make sure that we set up a game to have as much awareness and marketing behind it to get a large audience in at the beginning.
Hi, Kevin. Questions here. So with the success of Pokemon and AR, VR, the very hot state right now, what do you think Kabam's strategy on adopting a new platform? Especially you guys are building around AAA type of content.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of articles these days talking about, is Pokemon Go really AR or not? Does the AR really interact with the environment, or is it really could you do that in front of almost anything? I think of free to play specifically. So I should say, Kabam, first of all, we're not going to go into kind of premium games. I think that's a better business. It's just not how our business is set up. I think AR, VR incredibly exciting. I think it's probably going to be more of a premium download market at first, although there's currently a lot of stuff happening in that market from a price perspective. But I'm really excited. I think Pokemon Go just shows, if you do something really novel and you hit the market with a really exciting product that delivers on a brand promise that is fun to play, that social, you can turn out Pokemon Go, and I think it's really exciting. I think the thing that we're going to have to wrestle with as an industry is that some of these new platforms, with Oculus and and Valve, what are the hardware units out there versus what can we do as game makers to create content for that market. But I think as we talked about with Pokemon Go, 4.5 million downloads, a day, 2 weeks after the launch. We're not going to see those types of download volumes on a more dedicated piece of hardware for many years potentially. So I think mobile today is still really interesting, and I love the approach that Pokemon took in terms of starting to bring the promise of AR, VR to a mass market device that has 1 billion plus devices out there. And I think that helps to make the transition and get people more excited about, the promise of a true VR experience or a more dedicated AR experience. So I think it's great for the whole market. I think it'll be a while before we see enough dedicated VR hardware to have a big effect. But I'm excited about Morpheus. I think that'll be I think that's probably a really good shot this year to kind of break open the VR market, and we're certainly tracking it very closely.
Great. Let's give Kevin and Mike A round of applause, please.